Okay. Oh, someone entered. Cool. Okay, so yeah, so this unit is a bit interesting in that regard. It's kind of flexible in the sense of different professors do it differently, and it kind of, I get some creative freedom in that sense. I used to spend a whole lecture devoted to plants, but I saw that more often than not, people were just like, God, by the end of it. And so I don't spend as much time on plants. I think plants are amazing. I think they have incredible qualities to them that support life and contribute to biological systems. But that being said, for an intro bio class, not super critical. So we talk a little bit, and I'm just going to do a couple of slides on plants today, and mainly focus on animals. Because we are animals, it's a bit more relevant. A lot of you are heading into the pre-health field. Even for those who aren't, it's a little more, it's more relevant, it's more applicable, I think. But yeah, anyways, I think that's my spiel before we get into things. So let's begin. And let's pull this up here. Okay, plants and animals. Got water. So let's begin. Plants and animals. Plant characteristics. So like I said, we're going to just kind of cover very briefly plants. Very briefly. Get the notes out. So let's just talk about what defines a plant. The heck is a plant? There are some specific criteria that are required to be called a plant in this world. Okay. Some specific criteria. Plants, green for plants. They are photoautotrophs. So we talk about heterotrophs with fungi and the animal-like protists, the fungal-like protists with, we'll be talking about that with animals as well. Photoautotrophs, like the plant-like protists, these are organisms that are able to synthesize their own means of obtaining energy from food. Meaning they synthesize sugars by photosynthesis to extract energy from through metabolic cellular respiration, as we've discussed. So yes, like I mentioned, plants are eukaryotes. We're in domain eukarya, therefore they have mitochondria, and they are doing aerobic cellular respiration. But plants are special in the sense, just like the plant-like protists, in the sense that they can harness the energy of the sun, as we learned, and generate sugars to later break down to make ATP. But they do this in an autonomous sort of, they make their own food. So we call them photoautotrophs, and they perform photosynthesis. Who remembers the photosynthesis? in the, so we're in domain eukarya, there's eukaryotic cells that plants are composed of. So what is the organelle where photosynthesis occurs? It was originally a bacterium. It was originally a cyanobacteria that could photosynthesize. Yeah, the chloroplast, exactly. So perform photosynthesis in the chloroplasts. If you recall the light-dependent reactions, the Calvin cycle, NADPH, bringing back some haunting memories, I'm sure. Okay, plants are multicellular. Plants are multicellular. And I'm going to add that they're eukaryotic cells. We're just exploring domain eukarya this last unit, mainly because if you go on to take microbiology, you're really going to explore domain bacteria. So it's kind of fun to explore these, you know, kingdoms that you wouldn't normally be exposed to, just for a little bit. Multicellular eukaryotic cells. What are the cell walls made of in plants? Why was my lettuce salad, well, I had a sandwich, it was really crunchy because I put a lot of lettuce on it? Why is it all crunchy? Let me ask this. What are the cell walls made of in these plant cells? Does anyone remember the structural polysaccharide? Cellulose, you bet. Awesome. I recently learned cellulose is the most abundant polysaccharide on the planet. Just a fun fact. I think it's, yeah. And anyways, okay, so cell walls, multicellular eukaryotic cells with cell walls made of cellulose. Okay. So sort of interesting about plants is you guys can see this okay? The lighting looks kind of strange on my computer. Actually, let me move this. You see it fine? Okay, sweet. Maybe I'll just keep it then. Cool. Some plants reproduce asexually. I mentioned them before. Or rather, I should say some plants have the ability to reproduce asexually. Meaning that they clone themselves. And a few examples of these plants would be cacti can do this, succulents, and the one that I mentioned was strawberry plants. Back when we did, when we talked about mitosis and the reason why organisms would undergo mitosis. And there were like those three main reasons: growth and repair, or I'm sorry, growth and development, repair, regeneration, and then asexual reproduction. And I talked about those strawberry plants that shoot out the runner stems, and they give rise to identical clone strawberry plants. So only some plants are capable of this, meaning all plants This is kind of crazy to think about, but all plants reproduce sexually. All plants reproduce sexually. I know the first thought that came to my mind was, how do plants have sex? Well, I've mentioned that when in biology, sexual reproduction strictly just means the combination of genetic material from two different parent organisms. And plants do this all the time. They do this all the time, namely through pollination and even just releasing sperm cells that travel through water. And only certain plants do it this way. I have to brush up on my plant knowledge a bit, but essentially most plants release sperm in the air via pollen. Pollen grains actually contain sperm cells, fun fact. And the pollen, of course, lands on neighboring plants and can fertilize these plants by meeting up with egg cells that reside in the ovaries of plants. Plants actually do have ovaries, interestingly enough, where eggs are produced. And that's what would give rise to seeds. Okay, but anyways, so they all reproduce sexually. And I'll add produce egg and sperm. And another fun fact is, I'm pretty sure 99% of plants are hermaphroditic. I think that's the word, meaning they produce egg and sperm. They have the male development part and the female reproductive organ to produce eggs and sperm. Just underline that. And maybe I'll do this in the future. It's fun to, I don't know, I do actually like plants. I think they're fascinating. They have the weirdest way of reproduction it's called the alternation of generations, but I cut it out for this semester so we could talk more about animals and ecology and stuff. But yeah, anyways. Part of this alternation of generations is the fact that plants also produce spores, but you don't have to know that. We're just going to keep it here for plants. Just like fungi, they produce spores. All plants produce spores. Okay. So those are the basic plant criteria. Go down to my next. So there's one more thing I want to talk about with plants, kind of a cool thing that they most have. Vascular tissue in plants. Okay. So plants actually have tubes running throughout within them, and they're transporting mainly water and sugars to the rest of the plant. And there's specialized structures with names. Let's start with the title here, vascular tissue. And so there's two types. Two types of vascular tissue, meaning, so a vasculature, like humans also have vasculature. These are transport vessels. They are tubes that run throughout the organism to transport things, namely nutrients and water. We transport blood, and that's it, really. But, and lymph. We have lymphatic vessels, but blood actually contains a lot of stuff. Oxygen with red blood cells and our white blood cells that fight infection, nutrients like glucose and fatty acids, things like that. But in plants, there's primarily two types of vessels. The first are called xylem, kind of like xylophone. Spelled like this, xylem. And the xylem transport water. So these are vessels that transport water. Okay, second type, phloem. Spelled like this. So xylem and phloem. And these are the vessels that transport sugars, sugars. And that's all I want you to know about that. Now, if you look at the slide, you'll see that it's pretty interesting how plants devised this method. But when there's water, namely from the sky, rainfall, and maybe the plant is near a river, whatever it is, gravity brings that water on the ground, right? Well, the water is going to be absorbed by the roots. Here's the H2O. Other ions as well, but you don't have to know that. But when the water is absorbed by the roots, it's going to be transported through the xylem upward throughout the plant. Now, of course, the whole plant needs the water, so that's why the xylem are very important. We learned that the very first step in photosynthesis requires water. Remember, that was the electron donor in that very first step of the light-dependent reactions. So critical importance. And then, interestingly enough, the remainder of the plant that's exposed to sunlight is going to perform photosynthesis, not the roots, because it's underground, right? And no chlorophyll to absorb the light energy. And so when the sugars are made throughout the plant above, they travel through the phloem downward to the rest of the plant. So it's kind of like this neat inverse traveling sort of situation. Kind of similar to how we're transporting oxygenated blood to the rest of the body when we breathe into our lungs, and our blood vessels deliver oxygenated blood outward, and then the deoxygenated blood comes back. It's kind of like cool that organisms evolved these tubular networks of transporting essential molecules and stuff. Okay, that's it on plants. That's all I wanted to do for plants. I just wanted you to know the sort of the basics of what defines a plant, and these terms here. But plant life cycles, I mean, if you take organismal biology, if you explore really botany is where you really dive into plants and sexual reproduction of plants. It's fascinating. It's tricky. There are certain complexities, but anyways. Any questions before we move on to animals? Okay. Let's do it. So if you downloaded the slide, you'll notice I went a little crazy this morning with the cute animal pictures. So please enjoy while I erase the board. There's Mr. Seal or Mrs. Seal. Oh, puppy. I was preparing this lecture and spent way too much time looking up cute animal pictures because we're talking about animals, of course. It's a hedgehog. Your dog looks like that? Aw, cool. I don't know what kind of dog that is, but baby elephant. They're cool. Oh, it's a deer. A doe. Kitten. How many? I think I have one more. Yeah, Mr. Panda. Oh, so cute. Okay, that's it. All right. Characteristics of animals. Let's start there. Oops. Pull up my notes here. Where are they? Ugh, come on. Oh boy. 1 second. I forgot my thing in notes here. Pull it up here. Okay. Pandas even evolved? That's a great question. I don't know. I have no idea. Aw, husky puppy. Oh, cool. I will get a dog someday. I vow. It's my next goal, sort of. Is that my next goal? Yeah, pretty much. All right. So, characteristics of animals, also multicellular. And they are composed of eukaryotic cells that do not have cell walls. So they lack them. So composed of eukaryotic cells that lack cell walls. And this sort of explains why animals, unlike plants, are less tough, less firm and they're squishy. They're more flexible, right? Less rigid. That's the word than plants. They don't have that supportive, structural, protective cell wall that encloses around all the cells. This is why when you bite into a carrot or lettuce or a vegetable, it's got a crunch to it, right? You're crunching through these cell walls. But animals, on the other hand, fleshy and flexible cells. And in the microscope lab, when you look at cheek cells under the microscope, you'll notice that they're circular. They're not like boxy or rectangular like bricks. They're circular. They're sort of you'll notice that some of them are twisted and bent because they're, again, pliable. They're flexible because they don't have. We just have cell membrane. We don't have a cell wall that surrounds it when it comes to the cells in animals. What's next? Cells are organized into tissues. Organized into tissues. For example, nervous tissue. This is the nervous system. These are our neurons, which is the cell type of the nervous system. So nervous tissue, muscle tissue. It's got that organizational component to it. Movement. Animals move, unlike plants. They are heterotrophic, so they consume other organisms for energy. Including plants, right? We eat plants, we eat other animals, we eat fungi even, if you like mushrooms. And the last criterion at least it's like 99%. I think I Googled this once, but there's always one exception, when it comes to these types of things. But they typically reproduce sexually. Which would resulting in diploid offspring. Okay. So, I only get an hour and 20 minutes with you guys. So much to cover, and really this, well, I decided to, do ecology. Sometimes for next time, but I'm devoting most of this lecture to animal evolution because I think it's just kind of just fascinating. It's fascinating, and it explains a lot of, the origins of who we are. It's just really, it blows your mind. And so as we talk about what defines an animal, I want to tell the story now of how animals came to be. And this last unit is sort of like a history class sometimes. We talked about the early Earth, and we went through endosymbiosis and the origin of the eukaryotic cell, producing or giving rise to our ancient ancestors, our ancient eukaryotic ancestors, which were protists, which they're still around. There's amoebas and plankton and things, but the story of how animals not just came into being, but moved from sea to land. All life started in the oceans. And the transition to land actually was, in evolutionary time, kind of recent, approximately 500 million years ago. But of course, we've been talking billions of years. So it's, pretty amazing. So we're going to go into that now by really talking about specific animals and the specific characteristics of different phyla of animals, these groups of animals that came into being and evolved over time, and as evolution was taking place over time, over millions of years. And so it starts with the story of the first animal ever, which is actually thought to be, well, it's an interesting story because, like I said, with the protists are our ancient ancestors, and the very first animal that came into being with these criteria was actually, well, it had to come from protists, right? Because all that was around was protists. So something had to happen. This is evolution, right? Where mutations happen or changes occur over time that's going to end up with a new species coming about because it's very different. But the story of animals coming into being is kind of cool. So let's start here with okay, I lied. We're going to talk for a second about invertebrates versus vertebrates. We'll see how far we get today. But we start with invertebrates in this history lesson. The first animals for, I want to say, 400, 500 million years were invertebrate life in our oceans. And these were our first animals. These are our ancestors. So they lacked vertebrae, which is a protective structure made of cartilage or bone that protects a nerve cord. And so this is an example of what they call a Christmas tree worm. It's a worm. We're going to talk a little bit about worms today. Those are invertebrates. And on the right is a vertebrate. It's actually one of the most ancient vertebrates they're still around. It's called a lamprey. It's one of the oldest lineages of vertebrate life. And so they do have a protective bone structure that surrounds their nerve cord that has nervous tissue. Now, we have a spinal cord and we have bony vertebrae that protect it. So we are vertebrates. But I just want to introduce this concept because, again, for the first vertebrate came into being. I'm bad with dates. I got to get better at dates. But let me think. It's that. Is that the first? Let me see if I have it here, actually. I want to say 400, 500 million years ago. Ballpark. Let me see. Ah, 470. Okay. Close enough. Anyways. So let's begin. And this is it. This is our story here. The very first animal is thought, with all the evidence that we know with the fossil record and whatnot, is a sponge, Phylum Porifera. And sponges came into existence about 650 million years ago. And the story of how they came into being is amazing, and it has to do with the protists, as I've been saying. So let's go to the whiteboard, and then we'll come back to the slide. So Phylum Porifera, fancy name for sponges. These are the first animals to evolve. Okay. And so Sponges, I'm going to write in the interior, so inside of the sponge, which has a fancy name, the coelom, what is it? The spongiceal. You don't have to know that. But in the inside of the sponge, there are two types of cells, and they're working together. And they're called choanocytes and amoebocytes. So when we talked about animal-like protists, I'm taking us back to when we talked about protists before fungi. I mentioned that one of the animal-like protists are amoebas, which are these eukaryotic, heterotrophic protozoans, the animal-like protists, that engulf food particles and digest them. They're heterotrophic, right? And I mentioned they move by that pseudopodia, extending out their cytoplasm and retracting it to move around. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. And then another example of a protozoan is called a choanocyte, or a flagellate. Now these have tails. Remember the flagella, that was a tail. Remember the tail structure that's attached to cells that helped certain protozoans move. The last word, amoebocyte. And I'll show you on the slide as well. I can move this up. So that's what I want you to know is you got a choanocyte that has a tail for movement, flagellum, singular, flagella, plural, and then an amoebocyte. And amoebocytes are like amoebas, they are really good at taking in food particles, breaking them down, digesting them. And what happened in the story of the first animal is that the amoebocyte and the choanocyte started to work together. The amoebocyte said, dude, you are, I love your tail. And I think it's awesome that you can kind of make a current of some kind and make more food come towards me. Kind of use your tail to make the food come this way, or even collect more food by moving your tail. Wow, look at all this plankton in the ocean. I'm going to eat it. It was a much more efficient feeding strategy. So they started to work together. And then a bunch of them started to work together. And it formed the inside of a sponge. Here. So you have your amoebocytes. I think I spelled it wrong. Yeah, it's an O. Amoebocytes. And then you've got these choanocytes lining the interior, right? And what happens is called filter feeding. And so within the hollow interior of sponges, these tails are moving rapidly and they're moving water through, pushing plankton and food through, which, here are the food particles, it's mostly plankton, is ultimately going to travel to the amoebocyte, which is good at breaking it down and digesting it into nutrients. So it was the first multicellular protist, really, kind of thing, that two protozoans that became multicellular. And it all, so the rest is history, as we're going to talk about. So that's the story of the first animal. So let's write. Let's just write their feeding strategy. and it's filter feeding. That's what it's called. With pumping action of choanocytes and their flagella, their tails, together with digestion and digestion of let's write digestive action of amoebocytes. Yeah, so the entirety of it is an animal, and it's multicellular with different cell types within them. Exactly, and it's just like us. We have skin cells, we have muscle cells, brain cells, intestinal cells. The sponge has two cell types. It has the choanocytes and it has the amoebocytes. Okay, so sponges. And they're existing again around 650 MYA, or million years ago, right? Write that in. Million years ago. The next animal to come into existence, ancient, very primitive animal as well, the cnidarians, Phylum Cnidaria. Yes, that's pronounced Cnidaria, not Cnidaria or anything. The C is silent. How we doing on time here? Okay, we'll see how far we get. Okay, so Phylum Cnidaria. Let's just kind of define what they're about. So Phylum Cnidaria. So they have primitive nervous tissue. So they evolved primitive nervous tissue, meaning they can move their tentacles. So cnidarians, these include jellyfish, sea anemones, corals. These are cnidarians. And they have a primitive nervous tissue. They don't have a brain, right? They can move their tentacles, but that's about it. Permanent nerve tissue. And another kind of hallmark with them is they have two shapes, or morphologies, the fancy word for shape. They exist both in polyp form, so corals and sea anemones are polyps, and then the medusa form, which is what a jellyfish looks like. Although jellyfish early in their life cycle, they're actually, they form as polyps, but then they detach as medusas, interestingly enough. And you can see on the slide what these look like. Just show you really quick. So there you go. So you'll notice that they have a singular gastrovascular cavity, and it says mouth/anus. So yes, they have one body opening for the ingestion of food, the digestion, and then the release of the digested remains. So that's just kind of an interesting thing. They have single body opening. And then I guess the last thing I just want you to know is a few examples of cnidarians. So corals, jellyfish, sea anemones, actually, there's one more thing. Something maybe some of you have experienced, but hopefully not. Cnidarians can have cells that contain a stinging thread that can inject venom into prey. These are called nematocysts. So if hopefully some of you, or hopefully not too many of you have experienced this, but cnidarians have a picture here. These nematocyst cells that contain this stinging thread. And it's kind of crazy, but upon a mechanical stimulus or a force, this trigger is triggered and the thread discharges into the prey and releases venom that can paralyze the prey, cause inflammation. So these are called nematocysts. So I'm going to write have stinging cells called nematocysts. Called nematocysts. And we're still invertebrate, right? No vertebrates yet. The whole thing is a brain. Yeah, exactly. They kind of just float, waiting to run into prey. Just move their tentacles around. kind of a funny, quick story. One of the faculty in the department at my other school that I taught at previously, he's, this is his background. He did a PhD in this kind of stuff. And he was so interested in cnidarians and stuff that he saw a sea anemone. And, if you touch a sea anemone, you actually don't get stung. Our skin is too thick and their nematocysts can't penetrate the skin far enough for our nerves to detect the pain or whatever, and it doesn't affect us. But the epithelial layer on our tongue is very thin. We have lots of receptors too and lots of nervous tissue. So he thought, I wonder if I'll feel it. So he dove in and licked a sea anemone. And he did. And it hurt a lot, he said. I'm like, gosh, that wasn't very bright, but it's a funny story. So anyways, yeah. Okay. Anything for science, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Worms. Let's talk about 3 different phyla of worms. And I am going in evolutionary order in these, according to the fossil record, when these animals came into the Earth, our existence, by evolution and mutations and speciation. Okay, so there's going to be 3, and I'll kind of give a couple fun facts about each one. The first is called Phylum Platyhelminthes. Phylum Platyhelminthes. Phylum Nematoda. And then phylum Annelida. So I'll start with Platyhelminthes. These are flatworms. And the evolutionary trait that came into being with them is bilateral symmetry. So here's like a very rough drawing of what they look like. And you can see down the center there, it is symmetrical. Again, these are ancient organisms. And so they're not too complex. They actually evolved eyes, but they're very primitive. So, and they're just a collection of photoreceptors. They can't detect anything in detail. It's just light and dark that they can detect. So they have primitive collection of photoreceptors, put in parentheses, eyes. So next phylum, Nematoda. I know I'm moving kind of quickly here, but I do want to get at least one vertebrate done today. Then we'll see about next time. But phylum Nematoda, their claim to fame is 2 openings in the body cavity. So the body cavity has 2 openings, a mouth and an anus. So thank God they came about. Body cavity with 2 openings. Just leave it there. So Platyhelminthes, they actually, weirdly enough, they have, again, a mouth/anus, so 1 opening, and it's on the bottom of their stomach, underneath them. So Nematoda, they were the first animals with a separate opening for taking in food, and then another opening for excreting the waste material after absorbing nutrients, right? And then our last worm, phylum Annelida. These are our segmented worms. They have segmentation. So those little rings, segmented worms. And then I'll add one more fun fact. They were the first animals with a heart and a circulatory system to transport nutrients. So I'll add circulatory system. So earthworms, leeches, these are annelids, worms part of phylum Annelida. Okay. So 2 more phyla of invertebrates. Oh, is the circulatory system the reason Annelida don't regenerate? Oh, I have no idea. I believe it would be more complex. I know there's always, it has to do with stem cells, and I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that, to be honest. I'd have to look into it. I don't know if there are animals with a circulatory system that can regenerate. Actually, echinoderms. So no, I don't think so, based on my thinking right now. But it has to do with stem cells primarily. A lot of stem cell, but this is active research, and it's kind of like, how are reptiles, regenerating tails and things like that. Has to do with the stem cell properties and this ability to differentiate and self-renew and create new cells and rebuild tissue that we don't have, that we never evolved the ability. But we're still working on it. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it is interesting though. Definitely is interesting. 2 more phyla of invertebrate animals. Let me see here. Sorry, 3 more phyla. Oh boy. Okay, I have an idea. So we'll finish these phyla. Then next time we'll do a brief sort of vertebrate lecture, because there's some fascinating things, but then we can focus on ecology next time. Okay, so the next one come about are the mollusks, phylum Mollusca. Notice how we're still in the oceans. We haven't come to land yet. It's pretty crazy. So phylum Mollusca. Does anyone know any examples of mollusks? Maybe you've heard the word before. Really three main classes of mollusks, but I just want to talk about their shared traits. Nautilus, snail, yes. Snails, clams, you bet. Clams and snails are mollusks, absolutely. Anyone know one other that I'm resembling and I have 8 arms or tentacles? Yeah, squids and octopuses. These are mollusks. These are shelled animals. And yes, octopuses can create a shell. It's true. I remember reading about it, but yes. So all of these mollusks have a shell, and that's the first shared trait among mollusks, right? So let's write that. All have shells or can make a shell. Sometimes referred to as mantle tissue. Hermit crab. It's a great question. So hermit crabs are going to be part of our next phylum. So crabs are not because they don't make their shells. I think actually, I think it's a good question. Again, this isn't, well, I don't know if I mentioned, but this is, my master's, my background, my expertise isn't really in organismal bio. So it's kind of fun to refer to the textbook and for me to learn more. So there's always certain things I don't know. But what I do know is that crabs and lobsters are part of another phylum we're going to cover soon, the arthropods. And it's an exoskeleton. Their protective shell is an exoskeleton. So it might be made of a different material. It might be a different way that it's created. But all I know is they're not considered mollusks. The other trait, okay. The other trait, one other trait that mollusks have is they have a muscular foot. So they move with a muscular foot. Then I'll just write some examples of mollusks. So snails, clams, oysters, mussels, octopus, squid, that's enough. Okay, what time is it? Okay, 3 minutes, perfect. Perfect amount of time. Dude, I'm so annoyed. So remember how I updated my stupid computer? I have to access my notes in a different app now, and it's just finicky and annoying. But I have a Genius Bar appointment, and I'm gonna get it freaking solved. Yeah, anyways. Don't upgrade to Big Sur if you have an older Mac. Anyways, our next phylum, Patrick from SpongeBob. Sea stars, echinoderms. So phylum Echinodermata. Phylum Echinodermata. The echinoderms. So the echinoderms have a 5-part symmetry. I believe it's called pentaradial. Pentaradial, I believe. But it's 5-part symmetry. And they move by tube feet. They have tube feet that with suckers on them to stick to things. So they move by tube feet. So it kind of looks like this. Examples of echinoderms, so I mentioned sea stars. Anyone know any others? My dad actually just had a patient step on one 2 days ago. He was texting me about it. He was like, "Do you teach about these guys?" Yeah, sea urchins are echinoderms. Sea cucumbers, absolutely. I'll just put one more. What else do I have here? Oh, that's all I have. Okay. All right, sweet. It's 6:50, but I'm going to take 30 seconds to talk about arthropods really quick. Because then we can just be done with invertebrates, start off with vertebrates next time. Plus, I only want to mention like one or two things here. So, phylum Arthropoda, the arthropods. And really the one thing, they vary. They're very different arthropods. There's spiders, there's crabs and lobsters, insects. So, you know, they can have adaptations such as, adaptations, for example, wings. Insects have wings. Complex eyes with spiders. A universal trait they all have is an exoskeleton, an external skeleton, though. That they do all have. And that's all I wanted to mention. Man, time flies. Huh.